Today's conversation is with David Clary. I met David Clary when we were both working in the mining sector. I believe he spent most of his career in the mining sector, and I think he might have started as an engineer, but he moved into the sustainability field, and I think you're going to really enjoy hearing from David and how he got to where he is.
So today we're here with David Clary, who's the president of Inattain Incorporated, based in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. We were wondering if you could tell us what a typical day looks like for you.
Well, a typical day now, I left full-time employment a couple of years ago, and so it's probably more relevant to your listeners if I more talk about the role I had at Hudbay Minerals, which was a full-time role being in charge of sustainability for a mining company.
Sure.
And that I, in the latter part of my career, had a very, very broad role. I covered sustainability in mining. I think mining has a lot of impacts, positive and negative. And so, where you have an impact, there are people who will like that and won't. There is also, I think there are groups that sort of dedicate themselves to scrutinizing mining.
Right.
I'm not sure they always get it right.
Right.
And certainly we had groups challenge us on whether we were doing the right things down there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the standards become really important.
Right.
And at some level, there is a tension between kind of the environmental footprint our society takes up. The mining I was involved in was copper and zinc and industrial minerals, metals. And so those are the ingredients for our cars and our cell phones and all that sort of thing. So I look at it as that's part of the footprint of our economy. We've got to make sure when we do that, we do it in the most sustainable way that we can. But a mine still has a big footprint.
Yeah.
And so where we were in Peru, it was a very interesting experience. Peru is interesting from an indigenous perspective in a couple of dimensions. And one is, there has not been the recognition of indigenous rights in Peru historically the way there has been in Canada. But also Peru is very interesting because the southern part of Peru, which is where our mine was, is all land under title at this stage. So it's not like Canada where we have sort of big areas of crown land and a lot of mining takes place on crown land. In Peru, in southern Peru, it's all titled land. Now, how that came about is probably problematic. The sort of the Spanish colonization of Peru, to some extent, sort of bulldozed the indigenous groups and pushed them high up into the mountains. But the aspect that it brings today is all of the land is owned. So where you have indigenous groups in the south, they are sort of collective communities that collectively have title to the land that they're on. And so the only way you can open a mine is you have to negotiate with them to either buy or lease the land. And so in one sense, they have a high degree of control over what goes on because it's like people who own a house in the city. Nobody can come on that land. It's very different in the Amazon area because that's not titled land. And so I think there are activities that go on up there that do not have nearly the degree of engagement that we had to have in the South because there isn't title and there aren't clear boundaries and there are not as many mechanisms as we have in Canada for really soliciting Indigenous input. FPIC is a challenging term it's a simple term in concept, it's a challenging term in practice. So what constitutes consent can be challenging and can be challenged, and there are groups that do that. In the case of where we were, the law in Peru is a community cannot sell any of its land unless it gets a 2/3 majority vote from the community members to authorize that. So we looked at it where we were that, we kind of took that as consent, that if 2/3 of the community voted in favor. When I say like 2/3 of the community, this would be a community, maybe 1,200 people.
Okay.
That owned, a few square kilometers of the land that their community is on. So these community votes were very much standing in front of the community members and having negotiated with the community for the purchase price and that sort of thing. So it was actually very, very involved. was very much face-to-face.
It's sort of about perspective, right? So if you're coming into this concept and maybe this relationship between Canada and Peru and mining and the Indigenous communities, if you're coming into that wanting it to be unsustainable or not collaborative, then you could probably find that or find a way to frame it that way, right?
Well, yes, absolutely. Even we can have sort of conversations with friends looking at something going on in our own city.
Right.
Have dramatically different perspectives, and it's in one sense it's challenging, and I think it's sort of bringing this back to environment a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge is it's hard or impossible to be perfect.
Absolutely.
We're looking for how to be, and I was going to say adequate, but I don't think adequate is actually adequate. But
right,
it's how to get it right enough, and I think we often end up in those trade-offs and those negotiations. And as I say, in the communities we were in Peru, and it's similar in Canada with Indigenous communities, and many communities in the mines.
You'd think so.
For some people, it's an economic transformation for them, and they're very eager to have it. And for other people, it's a loss of the way their community was. And you could see the transformation in Peru in buildings and houses over a few years, progressing from thatched roofs and adobe walls to concrete buildings with steel roofs, and you could see the economic transformation. But again, some people, I think, were thrilled with achieving that. And other people, I'm sure, felt the loss of their kind of very quiet rural way of life. One of the things we have in Canada is a program called Towards Sustainable Mining. And it is an initiative of the Mining Association of Canada. It's a management standard. So there's a lot of guidance in it for companies on how to approach, how to collaborate. It's not prescriptive because different circumstances are quite different, but it's a very powerful standard, and it's originated in Canada a little over 20 years ago. It's now been adopted by national mining associations.
Wow.
I think 13 other countries. So it's a real piece of Canadian leadership in this area.
Yeah, seriously.
And one of the strong aspects of it, but also the very fun aspects of it, is it's largely governed by what we call our Community of Interest panel. It's a group that really hashes out what's an acceptable standard. We touch on FPIC in the Indigenous and Community Relations Standard. And so we had a debate with, including the 3 Indigenous panel members.
And you were there?
When I was there.
Yeah.
On how should FPIC be reflected in this? And the thing is, to some extent, the people in a panel like that are a little bit self-selecting. That they're people who are, who want mining to take place. They're not trying to stop everything. But the FPIC discussion was really interesting because they recognized that it's a term that's very hard to pin down, and they recognized all of the issues of, they in their communities didn't want one person to be able to stand up and not consent and stop everything. And so, those discussions were, I will say, fun. It was just really interesting to really be engaged with a group of people on how do we define what's acceptable here, and then create that definition, and then have that definition become what mining companies are following.
So you're really there during those types of conversations. How does that operation go?
Keep in mind, this is a group of people are on the panel for 3-year appointments. We had a lot of these discussions, but it was very much, it was peers around the table talking about what the right wording was. And I mean, sometimes it would get emotional, sometimes people would get
naturally
angry if they didn't think they were being understood or heard. But at the end of the day, it was a group that they wanted this standard and they wanted it to work.
To collaborate.
So it was a very collaborative effort, but with people who were very strongly defending their the aspects of the standards that were their sphere of work.
You've experienced these types of interactions specifically with FPIC in Peru, but you've also experienced it in Canada.
The legal structures are very different in Canada and Peru. Peru, it's only in about the last 15 years, I think, that Peru actually had a law really around Indigenous consent. And so that was relatively new there. And it's interesting, I mean, the legal consultation process it defined is very, very different from the Canadian process. The Peruvian process would be kind of at the end of, once you were actually applying for your permit, the government would hold some community meetings to get the community's input and consent. Canada has a much vaguer process. One of the things that's driven companies to do here is to try and engage very early with communities, because the government really, the way things run here, doesn't want to overrule the community. I mean, it does happen sometimes, where there will be community members saying, we don't want this to go ahead, and the government will say, well, you know what, we think collectively you've been consulted, and collectively.
Right.
I mean, in fact, Canada doesn't require consent legally. Our law is around consultation and accommodation, which in some ways is a more practical path, because it's not simply, they say yes or say no. It's defining a process. And
interesting.
You have to consult on the impact you're going to have on Indigenous rights, and then you have to discuss how you're going to mitigate or accommodate those impacts. So in some sense, there's more structure to it.
Right.
But it means at the end of the day, what the government is looking at and what courts would look at is, have you done the consultation? Have you made appropriate efforts around mitigation or accommodation? And so it's less around, did the community say yes or no, and more around, have you completed that process satisfactorily? That's not to say as a company, you may not be concerned about consent. And my boss at one point, our chief operating officer at Hudbay, he and I were in a community meeting, actually in Michigan in the U.S. with a community on a mine we wanted there. And he said something that I don't think you could ask more from a senior executive in a company. Because at one point, he said to the community, look, if you really don't want us here, most people in the community do not want this mine. It's not practical for us to be here. Right? So really he said, I mean, if the consensus here is you don't want us, we're not going to build a mine, because it's not going to be workable. Now, I think there's an engineering mentality, which is, if you have a problem, you look at how to solve it. And so I think, a lot of what goes on in mining companies is, in a sense, how to bring the community on board. And that's a combination of relationships. It's a combination of accommodation and adaptation. How do we make this acceptable, and how do we I'll say persuade the community that this isn't their worst fear, but this will be acceptable. Because often people, and I see it in Toronto, or you see it in Southern Ontario, when something new is going in, people can picture it in the worst way possible.
That's for sure.
And so that process of consent and that kind of position with the community, saying, if you really don't want us here, we won't be here. There's another part of that. It's saying, if you tell us you don't want us here, we want to talk that over. We want to understand why you don't, and we want to see if we can mitigate that. But at the end of the day, I think he's quite right that you can't operate in a community that really doesn't want you. So companies are very sensitive to that, mining companies certainly, that regardless of the legal process anywhere. All right. Nice to talk with you guys.